The first little session that we've got is going to be thinking about the Norman Conquest from the point of view of some things that are not the Norman Conquest. So Mike's going to talk to us about the perspectives from Roman Britain, and then David and Paul are going to look at Anglo-Saxon aspects in Anglo-Norman England. So what we're going to do is have the two talks back to back, and then also Gregor, because he has to go early, was going to talk to us a little bit about genetics and DNA, because he can't come to the second meeting, but we thought it was important to air some ideas, and then we'll have some discussion afterwards from the three talks. So please take it away.
Okay, well, I'm not sure how this is going to help you, but here we go. So Roman Britain, roughly 50 to 400, okay, 350 years plus. I guess now we perceive that change in the archaeological record is evident long before the mid-1st century AD, to the extent that until cities and rural establishments like villas are constructed from the later 1st century onwards, the Roman conquest of Britain is archaeologically invisible. So in our research on the rural settlement of Roman Britain, you couldn't see an impact of the conquest on rural settlement to any evident degree. And that may be relevant for the Norman period. So there's change before, it's difficult to identify the conquest. In contrast, the end is much more visible. The end is arguably very abrupt, certainly in material culture terms, in terms of social terms. And if you were asked to plot the settlements of Britain in, say, 450, you would have very few dots, because the population becomes archaeologically invisible to a great extent. Got to be mindful of the imperial context. Britain is one province of many. That the activity, the military activity in Britain, is often determined by events that take place far, far away. So that affects investment in the province, which also has potential impact on all sorts of activities, agriculture, trade, and so forth. The state control also has the potential to distort the market in all sorts of ways, and that's reflected in the curious patterns of material culture distributions between the south and the north as far as Britain is concerned, but also across the empire as a whole. So, for example, one of the most sort of distinctive forms of Roman material culture is, same in terracotta art, the red glossy you see at every museum where there's been a Roman presence, this Roman, fine Roman pottery. And it has almost a global distribution in terms of its type. And that has a lot to do with the underpinning imperial structure. Recently, I suppose, one area of research that's been important, and this again reflects, has been looking at issues of identity, looking at isotopes, looking at where people come from. In fact, I suppose that's been, to use Gregor's word, nuancing something that, of course, has been clear for a long time, that migration into Britain was well established, not least through the occupying Roman army and its camp followers. So there's a wider imperial context which kind of distorts things and may well explain what we see as the abrupt end of Roman Britain in the 5th century. I'm very conscious how it's difficult to refine chronologies in the Roman period. On the one hand, we have lots of coins with emperors' names on, and if you find them, got a dated artifact, and that's fine, but they rarely occur in contexts where you find them. They mostly occur at the end of a metal detector. But there are ways in which one can gain sort of brief flashes of insight into particular periods through, above all, through dendrochronology. So dendrochronology, for example, from Carlisle, giving clear evidence of Roman structural activity earlier than had previously been thought. Increasingly, radiocarbon dating is playing a major role in, as it were, defining settlement at the beginning and above all at the end. We have so much of the later Roman period for example, look at the cemetery evidence. You know, how long do these cemeteries go on? Nobody has systematically deployed radiocarbon dating to look at what goes on after 400. And if you're trying to investigate social change, economic change, it's actually when you go out into the towns, into the countryside, it's difficult to define periods of time narrower than about half a century. It's easier in an urban context, there's greater stratification, and you might have 5 or 6 clear, if investigating a particular site-wide phases. But in a rural context, for that period of 350, 400 years, you'd be lucky to have periods like late Iron Age, early Roman, late Roman. And again, if you're asked to characterize what happens around about the middle of the 3rd century, you'd be really hard put to do that because of the lack of contextual evidence to date settlement and change. There's also the issue for Britain of the archaeologically more invisible, the north and the west compared with the southeast. So masses of material culture south of the Fen Severn line. North of that, much scarcer, and the greater the need for radiocarbon dating to help calibrate settlement and urban change. And I suppose I've come across this, my flirtations with the Normans, excavating Pevensey Castle. It's a very interesting keep, Pevensey Castle, and we had masses of material from beneath it, but you could say no more than the keep was built on assemblages which contained Saxo-Norman, whatever that is, Saxo-Norman pottery. That's it. So when was that keep? How did it relate to the development of that castle? Remained kind of open. And again, just to illustrate the issues of chronology, back in the site which I of course know so well at Silchester, digging the amphitheatre, significant hall building, ancillary buildings, the only material culture associated again is ceramics, 11th, 12th, evidence for defence of that ringwork, and I postulated whether this was fortified, one of the anarchy castles, but no, who knows? Who knows? One of the things that I've often thought of, this is, as it were, using this 11th, 12th, whatever century evidence in a wider, is to think of it also cross-culturally. I mean, in Britain we do have very good data in context. I mean, particularly through archaeology of the last 20, 30 years, we do have some very good. And in my time, trying to sort of characterize and understand what was meant by urban, say in the 4th century, I kind of looked to see, well, okay, how was it in the 11th, 12th century? And you've got opportunities there, I think, to look at the material culture, to look at architecture and to make those comparisons, to try and get a better feel of what it meant to be living in a town in either period. So those are sort of the first reflections that I have, is where Roman Britain, looking back, may have some something to help you with, but probably questions would be more helpful than me just carrying on